An enormous library stood beneath a glass dome at the center of the old city, its shelves rising so high they disappeared into shadow, its air filled with the scent of paper, dust, and forgotten certainty, while narrow ladders leaned against endless rows of books that claimed to explain everything humanity had ever feared, believed, defended, or called truth. And despite the silence, the place was far from peaceful, because silence does not always mean peace. Sometimes it means avoidance. And nowhere is avoidance more beautifully disguised than in places built to preserve answers. And on that evening, scholars, teachers, students, priests, skeptics, and quiet observers moved between towering shelves carrying books, notes, and inherited convictions, each believing that knowledge and truth were the same thing, and that belief held everything together, because without it, certainty becomes difficult to defend. And at the center of that quiet cathedral of ideas stood Friedrich Nietzsche, calm, observant, untouched by the urgency around him, as if he were not searching for answers at all, but studying the people who claimed they already had them. And that difference did not go unnoticed, because people become aware of stillness, most clearly when they themselves are searching. And one of the younger scholars nearby, carrying more books than he could comfortably hold, finally looked toward Nietzsche and asked a question that sounded intellectual on the surface but carried something far heavier beneath it, asking why people spend their lives searching for truth if truth is what sets them free. And the question moved quietly through the marble corridors, because everyone who heard it recognized something personal within it, and truth, unlike information, rarely feels abstract, and Nietzsche did not answer immediately, and that silence created something unusual, because in places built on answers, silence feels heavier than questions, and heavy silence forces attention. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost softer than the turning pages around him. And he said that most people do not search for truth, they search for reassurance. And the words did not land like philosophy, they landed like exposure. And exposure rarely comforts at first. And the people around him reacted not with agreement, but with confusion, because the statement did not attack knowledge. It redefined the motive behind it, and redefining something so personal creates discomfort, and discomfort, when left without explanation, often turns into resistance. And one of the older professors laughed softly, dismissing the idea as philosophical drama, saying that human civilization, science, religion, and reason were all built on pursuit of truth. And the laughter spread, not because it was understood, but because it restored comfort. And comfort is what people reach for when something familiar begins to feel unstable. And Nietzsche did not react, did not defend his statement. And that lack of reaction slowly began to change the rhythm of the library, because when a person refuses to defend what they know, others begin to question what they know. And the laughter became thinner, less certain, and the library, once filled with answers, no longer felt entirely safe. The pages did not stop turning. The quiet footsteps between towering shelves did not disappear. The soft echo of books being opened, closed, and returned to places they had occupied for generations still filled the great library beneath the glass dome. And yet, somehow, everything began to feel different. Because once a thought begins to move inward, the world outside often becomes quieter, not because it changes, but because attention moves somewhere deeper, somewhere less comfortable, and the scholars, students, and observers moving through those endless corridors felt that shift, even if they could not fully explain it, because something had been introduced that did not fit with the confidence they had brought with them. And when confidence begins to weaken, awareness begins to grow, and awareness is rarely gentle, because awareness does not remove illusion. It removes the stories people use to protect it. And the people surrounding him felt that pressure begin to build, not outwardly, but inwardly, because now the question was no longer about truth. It was about why truth so often feels threatening in the first place. And personal questions are always harder to escape than intellectual ones. And the young scholar who had spoken earlier slowly placed his books on a nearby table, his movements no longer rushed, his posture no longer as certain as before. And after several silent moments, he looked toward Friedrich Nietzsche again, this time without performance, without intellectual pride, and asked what exactly people fear when they encountered truth, and the question carried something new, not resistance, not challenge, but vulnerability. And vulnerability is always more honest than certainty, because it appears when something real has finally been touched, and Nietzsche answered calmly, saying that people do not fear truth. They fear what truth demands they abandon. And the words moved to the library differently this time, because they did not explain deception. They exposed attachment. And exposure is far more difficult to resist than contradiction, because contradiction creates defense. But exposure creates reflection, and reflection is slower, heavier, and far more difficult to escape. And Nietzsche continued, saying that truth rarely destroys. Ignorance first. It destroys identity, because most people do not build their lives around what is real. They build them around what feels safe, what feels familiar, what feels accepted. And once something feels accepted long enough, it begins to feel permanent. And what feels permanent is rarely questioned. And what is not questioned eventually becomes part of the self. And once belief becomes identity, questioning it no longer feels like learning, it feels like dying. And the words settled into the listeners with quiet weight, because they did not describe self-deception as weakness. They described it as protection, and protection is something people rarely recognize within themselves. Because what feels like certainty often hides fear. Fear of losing belonging, fear of losing meaning, fear of discovering that years of loyalty, discipline, belief, sacrifice, or obedience may have been built on foundations never personally examined. And the people around him felt that idea begin to move through them, not as agreement, but as tension, because now truth was no longer something written in books, no longer something argued in classrooms, no longer something debated between scholars. It had become something far more personal, something internal, something that reached beyond the library itself. And one of the older professors, standing near a shelf of worn manuscripts, slowly removed his glasses, his expression harder to read than before, and asked whether all human belief is self, deception, and the question hung beneath the glass dome longer than expected. Because everyone standing nearby recognized something personal within it, and Nietzsche looked at him, not with sympathy, not with cruelty, but with clarity, and said that deception begins the moment comfort becomes more important than discovery. And the words moved deeper than anything before them, because they removed the comforting illusion that intelligence automatically creates honesty, that education automatically creates self-awareness, that knowledge automatically creates truth. And instead, they place responsibility where most people least want it, within themselves. And the scholars fell quiet, not because they agreed, but because something within them had already begun to shift, something that could not be undone through denial alone. And Nietzsche, seeing that shift, did not push harder, did not raise his voice, because the library had already done enough. And instead, he said that the most dangerous lies are not the ones told by others, but the ones repeated so often that they begin to sound like your own voice. And the words settled into the great library with quiet finality, because they did not promise clarity. They demanded surrender. The pages did not stop turning. The quiet footsteps between towering shelves did not disappear. The soft echo of books being opened, closed, and returned to places they had occupied for generations still filled the great library beneath the glass dome. And yet, somehow, everything began to feel different. Because what they were feeling was not doubt. It was something far more unsettling. A quiet realization that some of their deepest convictions may never have been chosen, only inherited. And for the first time, knowledge no longer felt like power. It felt like exposure. The books remained exactly where they had always been. The pages still turned. The ladders still leaned against shelves that seemed to disappear into shadow. And yet, somehow, none of it felt the same, because something had shifted, not in the library, not in the towering walls of knowledge surrounding them, not in the quiet movements of scholars carrying books, notes, and inherited certainty, but in the way those certainties were now being understood. And that difference was enough to change everything, Because once a person begins to understand truth differently, truth itself no longer feels like comfort, and the people standing beneath the great glass dome felt it, even if they could not fully explain it, because something had been introduced that did not require agreement to exist, something that had already begun to alter the way they understood belief, knowledge, loyalty, and the quiet identities each of them had built long before they ever learned to question them. And that alteration is what makes an idea dangerous, not because it creates confusion, but because it removes excuses. And Friedrich Nietzsche stood calmly within that silence, not as someone untouched by uncomfortable truths, but as someone who had stopped asking truth to be kind. And that difference was impossible not to notice, because kindness comforts people, but clarity transforms them. And the young scholar who had spoken first looked toward him again, his voice quieter now, stripped of intellectual pride, asking what happens to those who finally discover that the beliefs guiding their lives were never truly their own. And the question carried something new, not resistance, not challenge, but honesty. And honesty is always heavier than certainty, because it appears when performance finally ends, and Nietzsche answered calmly, saying that losing an illusion is painful, but building a life around one is fatal. And the words moved to the library with a kind of quiet force, because they did not glorify truth. They stripped it of romance. And romance is what most people hide behind when reality becomes too personal. And Nietzsche continued, saying that many people claim they want the truth, but what they often mean is that they want truth, as long as it does not cost them belonging, identity, comfort, relationships, reputation, or the story they have spent years telling themselves. And the scholars felt that idea settle into them with quiet weight, because now truth was no longer something to study, no longer something to debate, no longer something to admire from a distance. It had become something to survive, and survival is far heavier than knowledge, because knowledge only asks you to understand, but truth asks you to let parts of yourself die. And that is what most people fear more than ignorance itself. And the library fell silent, not because anyone agreed, but because something within them had already begun to shift, something that could not be undone through denial alone. And Nietzsche walked slowly toward the center of the glass dome where moonlight touched old marble floors. And without turning back, he spoke one final time, saying that the greatest lie is not what the world tells you. It is what you continue believing after reality has already shown you otherwise. And the words settled deeper than anything before them, because they did not promise enlightenment. They demanded responsibility, and responsibility is always heavier than certainty, because certainty asks you to follow, but truth asks you to stand alone. And no one spoke after that, because there was nothing left to defend, nothing left to laugh at, nothing left to hide behind. And as Friedrich Nietzsche disappeared slowly into the shadows between endless shelves and fading moonlight, the scholars remained exactly where they were, and yet none of them felt the same, because once a person realizes that truth was never meant to comfort them, only to free them, they cannot fully return to the comfort of who they used to be. The books remained exactly where they had always been. The pages still turned. The ladders still leaned against shelves that seemed to disappear into shadow. And yet, somehow, none of it felt the same.